The London Lloyd Evening Post on July 22nd, 1793, wrote the following. Quote, "The Count Bernstorff, Indiaman, lately arrived from the Cape of Good Hope, learnt from a country vessel that she had seen at sea last November a large vessel answering to the description of the Winterton, supposed to be bearing to the Mauritius. The Winterton left the Cape the 2nd of August.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Long Voyage from the Winterton."
Here we are. Enjoy!
There was a large amount of anxiety about what might have happened to the 711-ton Winterton and her rich cargo of £67,000 sterling by the 22nd of July, 1793. It seemed as though the East Indiaman had disappeared, and her previous track record did not inspire much confidence. One newspaper went so far as to describe the ship as having been marked for misfortune from the moment that she was launched. On her first voyage, she had sprung a leak. On her second, she was almost lost within sight of port. They did not say how. And on her third voyage, she had lost 50 members of her crew to an unspecified illness. The Winterton had not been heard of for almost a year in England, and even without such a track record, people were likely to think the worst, but with the history of the Winterton in mind, even more so. Not only that, but the Winterton was probably at least 10 years old. This was her fourth voyage, which was considered fairly advanced in age for the life of an East Indiaman. They went through long, hard voyages, and some ships did not even manage 4 voyages before they were retired. The Winterton had set out on her fourth voyage under the command of Captain George Dundas, who had also commanded her on the third voyage. The ship's third mate, John Dale, would write that he had taken comfort in having a captain with experience of the voyage in command of the ship. They lost sight of England on the 11th of April, 1792, and, according to all accounts, had nothing happen that was worth reporting until they reached the Cape and stopped at False Bay for water on the 20th of July. As reported by the papers, as concern for the ship mounted, they had departed False Bay on the 1st of August and continued their voyage. They almost immediately ran into difficulties, however. Captain Dundas had hoped to take the outer passage to India, but the wind was persistently blowing from the southeast, defeating this intention completely. Realizing that the wind was not going to agree with his plans, Captain Dundas instead directed his ship toward the Mozambique Channel. Captain Dundas was concerned about going through the channel since he did not trust the placement on their charts of the infamous Bassas de Indias shoal. To ensure that they would not hit the Bassas de Indias, they set their course toward Madagascar. Captain Dundas relied on lunar observations and 2 timepieces to try to determine what their position was. It was the same method he had used to navigate on his previous voyage with success. He therefore spoke with confidence when he said that they were 80 miles from the nearest coast when he was speaking with third mate Dale a little after midnight on the 20th of August. The third mate had just come on watch at the time, and Captain Dundas explained to him that, since they were going 6 knots, they would be entirely safe to continue their eastwards course until the morning. In spite of this assurance, Captain Dundas kept a close watch with his glass to see if he could spot any danger, and stayed on deck from midnight to 3 to observe their course. The only thing he did not do, the third mate would note, was order that soundings be taken, which would make sense if he really was confident in their position, but would have been in keeping with the anxiety apparent in his behavior. The anxiety would be justified a little after 3, when a very slight shudder would run through the ship. There had not been any signs of danger before the ship struck. There had been no breakers or sound of surf to tell them of the danger ahead. It was the night of the new moon, and the darkness almost certainly did not help them realize the danger they were in. It was also high tide, which had helped hide the rocks ahead of them. The collision also seemed very slight. The person who felt it the most was the man at the helm. They soon realized that this small collision had stuck them fast, and no matter what they attempted, from manipulating the sails to using the kedge anchor, nothing freed them. They had no choice but to wait until the daylight so they could assess their situation. With the light of day, they found that they had struck a rocky reef 6 miles from land. To the north and south on either side of them, the reef stretched for almost as far as they could see. Captain Dundas would take new observations of their position and calculate that they were about 63 miles north of the Bay of St. Augustine, Madagascar. It was clear to everyone that Captain Dundas's calculations before had some sort of error in them. They were 6 miles from the coast of Madagascar. They were also in great danger now that the tide was going out. As the water pulled away, the ship was now straining against the bare rocks and thumping against the reef with the waves. When the ship began to leak, the soldiers who were being transported on board of the ship were sent to the pumps, where they remained for as long as the pumps were functioning. Nothing could be done to stop the ship from beating itself against the rocks, and by 8 in the morning they had lost their rudder, and the sheathing was coming off of the ship. The ship seemed to settle around 8 though, and the people on the Winterton tried to find ways to lighten the ship in the hopes that she could be gotten off the reef and repaired. As part of the effort, they began to throw the ship's cannons overboard, but this had to be done carefully. Worried that if they were able to float off the rocks, they could damage the ship by striking one of their own cannons in such shallow water, they lowered each cannon into a boat and took it a distance away before they sank it. By 3 in the evening, they had made as many efforts as possible to lighten the ship, and the tide had come in. But the ship still did not float off the rocks. With this, it was decided that the ship truly was doomed, and they turned their attention to how they could get everyone to shore safely. In an effort to keep the ship together as long as possible so that they could plan the evacuation, the masts were cut down, which reduced the amount of strain on the Winterton. They also began to gather survival supplies on deck. Captain Dundas gave the order that every cask of spirits that could be found on the ship be destroyed as well. The officers had heard stories of crews falling into drunken disorder on such occasions, and it was something they wanted to avoid. In the meantime, the ship's second mate, Nathaniel Spence, and purser William Dunn were dispatched in a yawl to scout out a landing spot for them on shore, while 3 other boats were put out to sea on a long rope with some sailors on board so that they would be ready in case of emergency, but not smash on the rocks or the ship with the changing tides. As evening fell, Captain Dundas gathered everyone on the ship together to address them. In the speech, he laid out that their best chance of encountering another ship and getting help was to travel to the Bay of St. Augustine and the course that they would take to get there if they reached the shore. He asked that everyone continue to obey the officers even in this difficult time, and he assured everyone that he had no intention of leaving the ship unless he was certain that everyone had been saved. It was a speech that raised the morale of those on board the ship, and a passenger would note that the evening was spent with the sailors in a strangely celebratory mood. Some of the sailors had begun to play music, while others joked and told stories, an attitude that he admired, but one that the passengers could not bring themselves to emulate. At around midnight, an incident occurred that would remind everyone of the immediate danger that they were in. During the night, large waves had begun to wash over the stranded ship, and the people on the ship heard the screams of people in the ocean. The 3 boats that had been floating near the ship, the Winterton's longboat, cutter, and jolly boat, had all been smashed against the rocks by the waves, and all the men who had been stationed on them were lost. It was a sobering moment, and when Captain Dundas saw the yawl returning from the shore the next day, He signaled for them to keep away from the ship. They all acknowledged the signal and returned to the shore. They all did have a chance to communicate to those on board that everything on the shore was exactly as they had seen from the ship. A rough surf pounded the beach, and no spot seemed to be safe from that danger. Still, they were going to have to make the attempt, and the crew got to work fashioning the ship's poop deck into a giant raft, which they filled with provisions and then placed all of the women there. During the night of the 20th, going into the 21st, the hawser that had been holding the stern of the Winterton in place parted under the strain of the waves that were battering her. With this, the ship now swept broadside onto the rocks. The battering that she was taking was too much, and it became clear that the ship was breaking apart. The passengers and crew who had been preparing for this moment rushed to their various positions, ready to make use of already made rafts to try to reach the shore. Meanwhile, the final places that were holding the poop deck in place on the ship were cut away, so that those who were able to fit on it could also make for the shore. First Mate Charles Chambers did his best at that moment to convince Captain Dundas to also make an effort to save himself, but Captain Dundas had clearly given up. He simply stated that he could not see any point of such efforts, that they would be useless. He did, however, instruct everyone else on the ship to do their best to ensure their safe escape from the ship. It was later reported by the ship's carpenter that as the ship broke apart, Captain Dundas had been washed through the quarter gallery, and no one had seen him afterwards. First Mate Chambers would also never reach the shore. The third, fourth, and fifth mates had created a raft for their use, and on this they were washed away from the ship, as were some other rafts, and people clinging to the pieces of wreckage. The mates had believed that the ocean would carry them to shore naturally, but the currents acted against this, and it was not until the morning of the 22nd that they managed to reach the shore after a lot of rowing. Traveling along the shore, they came to the poop deck, which had washed on shore with 60 to 80 people in total on it, including 5 of the female passengers and several of the gentlemen and officers who had been traveling on board. The people on the raft had experienced a miserable passage. The deck was so crowded that it was in danger of sinking, and there was no dry place to sit or stand. They had also been forced to paddle vigorously for shore in order to reach safety, and they had barely made it. For some of the other people on board the Winterton's wreckage, safety came in the form of fishing boats that were launched from the shore. The local fishing population, which it was noted was very skilled in diving, soon began to strip the Winterton of anything of perceived value, including its valuable cargo, but they also willingly brought anyone they found still clinging to the wreckage to shore. It would not be until the 26th that the last survivor landed, and they could take stock of what had happened. In addition to the loss of Captain Dundas and First Mate Chambers, 3 female passengers had been lost, as had 16 of the sailors and 25 of the soldiers. They also had no chance of securing any provisions from the ship or setting up camp on the shore. The local population had boats, and they did not, and they were very effectively taking anything that would be needed for survival. The group, therefore, with Captain Dundas' directions in mind, began to walk. After a walk of several days, a group of the survivors arrived in Toliara, which had been an East India Company supply port until about 10 years before. That was no longer the case, however, and the survivors were told that only one ship from the East India Company was expected once a year. The group decided that this was far too long, and they waited anxiously for news of the yawl with the second mate and purser, since it would be easiest to find help if they had a boat. In the meantime, the group was welcomed with the hospitality of a man they referred to as the King of Baba. Baba, meaning father, was acknowledged to not be the man's true name, but there does not seem to have been any record of what his name actually was, and all of the survivors just referred to him in this way, something that the King of Baba does not seem to have objected to. Thanks to the trade that had passed through Toliara over the years, language was not a difficulty, and after learning about what had happened to the Winterton, the King of Baba seems to have done everything possible to make the group as comfortable as possible. He provided protection, housing, food, clothing, and, when he had time, even kept them company. There is no account of the Winterton that does not include praise for the kindness and generosity of the King of Baba. They had not all walked to Tuliara in a cohesive group. Some people had reached the shore late, and others had been too worn out or weak to keep up with the first group to reach the town. The King of Baba had even sent out people to find the stragglers, make sure they were fed, and guide them properly to Toliara so they would not get lost. The group being finally united was a relief to everyone, especially with roofs over their heads. The castaways got even greater peace of mind when the yawl appeared in the river of Toliara. Third Mate Dale immediately got to work converting the yawl into a seagoing vessel to try to reach Mozambique and get assistance. They put a false keel in the boat and rigged her out with sails. A compass had been placed in the boat when the second mate had left the ship looking for a landing spot, and they had found a quadrant washed up on the beach. The main issue was a lack of charts, but one of the soldiers had a geographical grammar that was offered up. The King of Baba watched this activity with concern, and on multiple occasions tried to persuade the group that their plan of action was too dangerous. It would be better to remain with him and wait for the ship the following year, where they would be safe and they would want for nothing. Third Mate Dale did not have such a large amount of patience, though, and the rest of the group supported his decision. On the 12th of September, Third Mate Dale set out, in company with Fourth Mate Joseph Wilton, a passenger named De Souza, who was brought along for his knowledge of Portuguese, and 4 of the sailors. Soon after the yawl had departed, the fishermen who had been taking the money from the wreck of the Winterton arrived to present the funds to the King of Baba, as was considered his right. The King of Baba, in turn, held a celebration, but then gave an amount equal to $20,000 to the survivors of the Winterton. It was a generous deed, but one that initially caused chaos as people made the effort to grab as much as they could. The officers asked for the King of Baba's intervention, and he took the money back and decided to divide it among them as he saw fit. The officers still voiced some concern. After all, they considered it technically the East India Company's money. But the King of Baba told them that he now considered it his money, since it had been taken from a wrecked ship, and he was giving it to them as a gift. This money would allow them to all live comfortably for the remainder of their time in Madagascar. This was far more comfortable than the situation that the group in the yawl found themselves in. The provisions that the boat had been provided with proved to be entirely inadequate. They were all perishable, and the water had been stored in calabashes, which broke in rough seas. It was soon made clear to the people on the boat that they would not be able to reach Mozambique Island as they were, and they instead consulted the geography text to try to determine the closest settlement and then turn towards Sofala. Sofala at that time was a Portuguese settlement, and when they arrived there on the 20th of September, they were met with great hospitality from the governor, who gave them his own boat to use, as it was a better sailer. This boat was provisioned, and they set out again on the 12th of October. But they soon found that the boat they had been given was in very poor repair and was leaking so badly that they had a fight to keep it afloat. They turned around, but they did not get back to Sofala until the 20th of October. This time, the reception they met with was openly hostile. The governor was clearly not happy to see them back, and he sent them on an 800-mile hike to their intended destination rather than giving them any more assistance, ignoring all of their protests of poor health and their weakened states. The group, under the leadership of Third Mate Dale, departed from Sofala on the 1st of November. The area that they now traveled through was a desolate wasteland, where in the space of 40 miles, they did not see a single person or building, and they surrounded themselves with fire during the night to prevent any encounters with wild animals. As ill-prepared and weakened as the group was, it was therefore fortunate that the governor of Senna had heard about their plight, and sent palanquins to carry them to Sinna. Here they were treated with kindness, but the health of 3 of the members of the group was already ruined. Fourth Mate Wilton and 2 of the sailors passed away in Senna. The remaining members of the group were placed on a vessel headed for Kilimani, where they arrived on the 12th of February, 1793. The governor in Kilimani also treated them with great kindness, nursing them back to health and listening to their story with sympathy. He regretted it, but there were no ships belonging to the Portuguese government, so he could not help them. But he did offer his assistance in chartering a ship. The assistance of the governor must have been great, because they were able to charter a ship without signing any promissory note for payment of any kind. After 8 months away from Madagascar, Third Mate Dale and the remainder of his group were finally coming back with help. They would return to find that the castaways of the Winterton that they had left behind in Toliara were now almost half of their original number, though not for want of care by the king of Vaba. A malaria epidemic had swept through the group, and the people who had survived were mostly the weakened survivors of the same disease. Among those who had been lost was Second Mate Spence, meaning that Third Mate Dale was now the only surviving officer from the Winterton left. The voyage just down to the beach to get on the ship was a daunting one for the sickly group, and at least one sailor chose to remain in Toliara. The survivors from the Winterton were now brought on board the ship that the third mate had chartered, a small 150-ton boat with only one cabin into which the women were placed. The men, in spite of their weakened states, were compelled to sleep on the deck. By the time that they were landed back on Mozambique Island, it was clear that more of them were in a state where survival would be difficult. For the 2 months that they stayed on the island, waiting for a ship to be gotten ready for them, 30 more people passed away. This time, using the funds of the East India Company drawn on by Third Mate Dale and the purser, they were able to hire a larger ship with 2 cabins to make their way towards Madras. The ship was still so crowded that 12 people chose to remain in Mozambique until another ship could pick them up. They were reunited in Madras as they waited for another Portuguese ship to be made ready. The group was doomed to face one last indignity as they drew close to Ceylon, where they were going to stop for supplies. In the distance, they saw a ship they believed to be an English vessel, and they drew near her to speak. Unfortunately, it proved to be a French privateer named Lemoutin, who first fired on them and then took them captive. The Portuguese commander, and Captain Dale as he now referred to by the group, were taken onto the French privateer, as were 20 or 30 of the healthier people among the survivors. Meanwhile, a prize crew was put onto the Portuguese vessel, and the 2 ships separated. The Lemoutin had been in search of a Dutch Indiaman when they had fallen in with them, and a few days after capturing survivors of the Winterton, they found the ship they had been looking for. The French privateer had clearly underestimated the strength of the Dutch ship, however, because the engagement only lasted 15 minutes. At the end of which, the roles were reversed on the ship. The French sailors were prisoners of the Englishmen, were free again. Captain Dale and his group found themselves on the East India Company ship, the Drake, which took them to join the siege of Pondicherry. Here the group was separated with the sailors, who were still with Captain Dale, being pressed into service. It was only after the siege had lifted that Captain Dale was able to proceed to Madras on the 20th of August, 1793, exactly a year after the Winterton had wrecked. As for the group that had been left on the Portuguese vessel with the prize crew, they suffered for some time in a becalmed state as supplies ran out before they were finally brought in as a prize to Mauritius. Here, they were allowed to reside with an Englishman and his family, though they were still considered prisoners. To the amazement of the people from the Winterton, here too they were met with kindness and well cared for until shifting political situations gave them a chance to ask to leave. They chose to send the women in their group to ask for leave to depart, a tactic that proved effective, and they were soon on an American vessel headed for Madras. They were told that almost as soon as they departed, the government on Mauritius had changed their mind about letting them leave, but it was too late. On the 16th of January, 1794, they also set foot on Madras. It had been 20 months since they had left England, but the people of the Winterton had finally arrived at their destination.
For more information, please see the Mariner's Chronicle published in 1826, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.